Alright, everybody, welcome to what will hopefully be something that's popular in future episodes on the channel. But I've been talking about doing kind of like a live presentation on a game design topic for a while now. And we have a little bit of free time during the end of the year, so this is going to be our first kind of take on this. And I want to hear from people about what they think in terms of the content and kind of the overall presentation, because we were planning on making this kind of like a Patreon, some kind of Patreon related thing for the backers. Now, I'm not sure how things will go with that, but for people watching this live, you'll be able to ask any questions regarding UI design or any of the topics we're going to be discussing. And for people watching this recorded, because there'll be a lot of cuts to various sections, I'll be cutting that out during the recording, so you won't be seeing that. But thank you for everybody watching this regardless. So for this first one, I really wanted to focus on UI design as kind of like our first big topic, because it is a very underrated aspect, I feel, of game development. And it's one that I think a lot of developers tend to mess up on because there's so many little facets to it. I even have my own little schedule here in terms of what I'm going to talk about as well. But UI design obviously refers to anything that is related to the user interface. And we can split that down into the on-screen elements, or the GUI, as well as the control scheme and things along those lines. Now, the footage that you're seeing, of course, is from Super Mario Bros., or Super Mario World specifically. And the reason why I brought this game up as kind of our first example is that action-based design always has it, I think, a lot easier compared to abstracted and more complicated game systems. Because of the fact that the player is essentially in complete control of their character, you don't really need as much on-screen elements to help the player out. Now, if you look, I'm not sure if you can actually see my mouse. I think you won't be able to. But if you look on the top of the screen, the only real UI elements that are on there is the player, lives, coins, item, time, and score. And if you've also paid attention, you'll see that there is kind of like a little bit of a framing effect. Even though it looks like there is no, it looks like they're just all flying up there, which we'll come back to in a later section, it's still something that is a lot harder to, let me check. A good UI has to be both readable and also give the player proper information about what is going on when it comes to the game itself. And like I said a second ago, the reason why action-based games work so well is that they allow for things to be very simple and very easily understood. I'm going to switch some of the footage as well. This is more of a modern retro game. And when you look at the UI itself, this one is kind of framed. Let me shrink again. Make sure everything is legible here. There we go. When you look at the UI of Odalis, this one is framed vertically. And this was a very rare example of using this kind of design. I think it's the only one that I can actually think of that's done it. And one of the reasons why this works so well is that, once again, it provides a very easily understood UI for what the player needs to know at any given time. And this is one of the basic elements of good UI. That whatever is on your main screen, again, the major point that the player is going to be looking at all times, that information needs to be readily available on the actual main UI. And again, for a lot of strategy and abstracted based designs, they tend to struggle with this because you need to know a lot of stuff to play a game like Xcom or Civilization or Stellaris. So how do you know exactly what to show on your main screen? And that is one of the great mysteries of UI development, is that everything or every game has its own unique elements, or things that need to be shown in order for the player to understand what is going on with it. And if you don't have that, there's no way for the player to figure things out. Now, with Odalis here, with that kind of design, it's very easy again to understand exactly what are the main screen elements. And we're going to move on in a second to talk more about examples of bad or not as good UIs. But for the people watching this live or recorded, if you pay attention to what is shown on screen, there are a few things that I would argue aren't 100% required for the player. And can anyone figure that out in terms of what is being displayed? And you can see it down here, but the orbs, that represents the currency. And while I queue up some additional footage, see if you can answer what are some of the things that are not required. Now the thing is that the equipped items do tell you what abilities you have. I would argue with that as well. Like for right now, you don't really need to know what the armor is because we see that on the player. Nor do we need kind of the sword. Now bag is kind of hard to make out just due to how the screen is. Let me see if I can shrink that up just a little bit. I don't know what happened with this window. I had it all properly spec'd and then it screwed up right there. But yeah, stuff like the equipment, armor, and sword aren't necessarily needed. Yeah. Now I would say the health is obviously important, but it could have been moved to any one of these panels. I think the thing about this kind of vertical pane versus a horizontal is that normally when you're playing a game that has a horizontal plane, repeat the whole thing, Draken? But normally when you have a horizontal plane, your eyes have to be focusing between two different points. The main screen and then looking down or up at the other one. And you'll see that when we get to some other examples. With this kind of UI, as I'm watching that footage, my eyes can see pretty much the entire scope of the UI. And I think that's one of the reasons why it works so well compared to something like in Castlevania or any other horizontal plane focus. So I'm going to load up that footage really fast here. Hopefully fast. There has to be a better way to organize these windows, I feel. But we're going to look at Rise to Ruins for a second here. Now, like I said a second ago, when we talk about bad UI, it's never a case, I think, of a game just being all around horrible in terms of its UI conventions. And it really depends on kind of what is being shown. So if I can stretch things out just right. So, I'm going to actually get rid of the text and our little box as well, so you can kind of see what's going on at the bottom of the screen. But this is the UI for Rise to Ruins. This is a god game kind of village simulator. We am playing this on stream. And there are a few key things that stand out immediately in terms of its UI. So can anyone figure out why there are some bad elements with this UI right now? The answer is that there is no semblance of framing going on here. My eyes have to be focused on, we could argue, 6 different spots on the UI right now. You have the kind of building information in the upper left. We have resources at the top, building and workers on either side, and then kind of this stat box down here, which to be honest is not really needed, at least most of the time. The only times where it would be acceptable is when we're clicking on a building, like right there, in order to upgrade. But for the most part, it's not necessarily needed on the screen. But the problem and why you kind of need to have some kind of semblance for your UI is that everything is kind of set up all over the place. And because of that, the player doesn't really know what they should be focusing on, let alone what are the primary areas. For instance, I think it's very important to know how many buildings you have or how many buildings you're able to build. And that is a very little icon way in the upper left hand corner of the screen. Another point that I think a lot of developers tend to struggle with is being very obsessed with alphabetical organization. On the right hand side, maybe a little bit hard to make out on the UI, but you can see the various buildings I can construct, and they're all labeled, they're all presented in terms of alphabetical order. Now, it sounds like that makes sense, but the problem is, as a player, I don't know what is important. What should I be focusing on first? And this is why tutorials and UI usually go hand in hand. Because in the tutorial, you need to explain to the player what is happening or what they should be looking at. And if anyone has any UI related questions, let me know in the chat window down there. It's very hard to know where the player should be focusing their attention on. And when I'm going to switch the footage around here, there's got to be an easier way to do this, I feel. But when we look at Xcom, this is an example of a game that it has good elements to it, but it's still overall not that great of a UI. So the good thing is that we have the framing. All the information that we need about what's going on is presented at the bottom of the screen. You have your various commands, you have the inventory, you have stats, the overwatch options, etc. The problem with this is that none of it is really labeled or is really presented in a way that makes sense to a player. And that is a common issue for a lot of some of these games. Jack and Castle. No, I have not heard of that one. Jack and Cassie, I'm sorry. Yeah, and like I said, the UI for the DS definitely is probably its own unique section. But the problem is when you're looking at this UI, I'm going to actually see if I can pause the video for a second, just so it's not moving around too much. But when you look at the UI for Xcom right here, for anyone who has not played the game, would you be able to tell what all those buttons along the bottom of the screen represent? Especially when you have up and down arrow here, and then the same thing up and down over there. Now, of course, if you played the game, you know that this means, switch characters, and this means switch the depth of field, or what level of elevation you're looking at. But I still don't know what, this command means. I know that is map, I know that's evac. But this is why a lot of games have made, or why a lot of the older games don't hold up well, is that they kind of went with their own original, or their own one-off UI, which in turn makes it a lot harder to kind of figure out what is happening. And I could easily load up some footage of Stellaris, for instance, and see if you can figure out what is going on with that if you haven't played that game already. Now, another thing that makes these kinds of games very hard to keep track of is that, like we said earlier, when it comes to games built on multiple layers or multiple screens of UI, each screen basically needs to convey different information. So when you're looking at something here with Xcom, you not only have the tactical layer, you also have all these various elements of managing your resources, what researches I need, organizing my base right there, the geoscape. And again, this all begins to compound on itself in terms of learning a game. I don't have any footage of it, I believe, on the channel, but something like The Last Federation, I think it was called, from Arkham Games also ran into that problem, that they need all these different UIs, and you're essentially having to relearn the game with each UI element to it. Now, another example of probably something that is not on the best side would be games that kind of overload the screen. And I'm trying to think if I have any good examples of that in my video category here. But while I'm trying to think of something quickly, can anyone think of a game, or think of games that kind of went too much in terms of their UI and just completely overwhelming the player? Now, another thing while I'm trying to think of some examples is that when you're trying to build an effective UI, you want to go for as few screens or as few kind of screen transitions as need be. And again, that is a very tough prospect. There's a presentation that George Fan, again, one of my favorite examples from Plants vs. Zombies, gave about all the little tricks he found in terms of making the UI very easy to understand. And one of them was you should not have more than, I think, 5 or 6 words in any kind of tooltip. It should be quickly explained by the player. Oh, that's good. Yeah, and there's definitely been, I think, a lot of YouTube videos and such on that topic. But I'm going to switch the footage and see if I can find a game that went a little bit too much in terms of UI. When you look at this footage here of mid-boss, you can see all these various stats. And as I click to level up, it's kind of hard to tell what I'm changing. Like, if you saw right there, let's see if I can rewind that a second. When I click the up to change the stat, if you looked very carefully, you notice that my damage went up by 1 point, from 2 to 9 to 2 to 10. Now, that is very hard to make out unless you were actually looking at that. And you have to be careful when it comes to this kind of information. Because normally when you look at RPGs that allow you to change stats or compare things, you want to make it very easy, very plain in terms of how things are going to change. In Phoenix Point, for instance, there is a section there where the item comparisons were not really shown right. It was shown right to left instead of left to right. And that really threw me off while I was playing that game. And that's another very important point when it comes to UI design. Whenever you are trying to build a UI to a game, you want to use as many quote-unquote shortcuts as possible. Some of the big ones are using affordances, such as if something has like a secondary association, it's a lot easier to use that as shorthand for your UI. A popular one would be using red as health, blue as mana or magic in a RPG or in any kind of RPG-based game. Another example from controllers is why you use the right or you use triggers for fighting or for shooting rather than the buttons, because you associate the pulling of the trigger with the pulling of the trigger on a gun. And a lot of this stuff seems very simple, but it becomes very hard in practice to do. Now, as I'm trying to go over this, and that's another really good point about colors, that it's better to use a color convention for a video game rather than color conventions for a country, or using conventions that are popular in one country to another one. A very weird example is how some games will flip what is the confirmation button in them. Like in Japan, I think it's usually the B is confirm, while in the US it's A is confirm. And this was something that we saw with a lot of older style, like PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 kind of games. And when you're looking at popular UIs, obviously you don't want to copy things verbatim, as literally taking the code or taking the same assets. But things such as where information is based is very useful. Now when we look at the UI for mid-boss here, it is laid out pretty well in terms of where your eyes should be focused. I would maybe argue that instead of having the map in the upper right, move it to the bottom. Oh good, and YouTube is playing an ad. Oh, YouTube with these videos. And yeah, cultural differences is a very big point. But I would argue, like, I still don't know what that little fireball is doing in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. But we could probably move the map, or maybe even our powers, down there as well. Because again, you want to avoid the player having to do this as they're playing the game, just constantly having to switch their focus in terms of their eyes. Now, one thing that the game does that is a very basic element of all UI design is having tooltips. And tooltips are the essence of good UI. Whenever you have something on the screen that's an icon or something that's not easily explained by one word, use a tooltip to basically elaborate on that. And the best part is that they can go away in terms of information. With something like Age of Empires and any real-time strategy game, again, we have this framing effect going on. You have at the top are basic resources, the age, and commands. The bottom of the screen, you can't see because my little window is blocking it, but you have the text side, the map, as well as details about what I'm clicking on. And one of the things that Age of Empires does, do it at a later time. We don't want to be too distracted here. But one of the things that Age of Empires and Ensemble did was have layers of tooltips. Rise of Nations did the same thing. That if I just put my mouse cursor on an icon, it will pull up with some basic information. This is a farmer. He gathers resources. But I can also add more detail by clicking on Advanced Tooltips in the game options. Then pulls up stuff like, this unit does 3 points of pierce damage, has armor of 2 light armor, is weak to X. And for most players, they are probably never going to need that level of detail. But it helps players who are trying to learn the finer elements of this UI. Now, I would like to load up some footage of Labyrinth of Refrain, but I'm afraid of where I'm showing in terms of how risque that game is. But one of the problems Labyrinth of Refrain did in terms of its UI, the empty space is used, you were talking about probably down there. It does load up with just basic descriptions of elements, what I'm kind of focusing on with units. But one thing is that the problem with Labyrinth of Refrain is that it runs into a problem with properly showing information. For instance, I can't easily see what gear is actually better for a unit. There is a optimize option, and I've been using that in my game, but it ran into a very big problem. It only optimizes for the prime stats, attack, defense. It doesn't optimize for important things such as resistances, special abilities, and so on. And you haven't... Oh yeah, we gotta play a more AoE, right? But you have to be really careful with, again, what information the player needs at any given time in order to make a decision. And one of the strongest, or one of the worst things you can do in terms of UI is force the player to switch multiple windows to find information. So what that means is, let's say I need to figure out what is the best research for my military right now. So I have to go into my military screen to see what I currently have unlocked. Then I have to go to the research screen to see what is available. But then I have to go to another screen to see if I have the resources for it. And I think another thing a lot of developers, especially first-timers, fail to realize is that it's okay to repeat information if that information is relevant. And what we mean by that is whatever I need at the current moment to make a decision based on what's on screen, I should be able to see that. One thing that really drove me crazy about Labyrinth of Refrain is that every class has a primary attribute to it. And I'll rewind the footage here so that we can see more of AoE while I'm talking. But every class in Labyrinth of Refrain has a primary attribute that dictates its overall damage. The problem is that you cannot see that information anywhere outside of the screen that you're using to choose what class to make a character. There we go. And that is not good design. You should never force the player to remember information that can be displayed on the game screen when it's important. And that takes me to an example of both good and bad UI. Darkest Dungeon here is an example of both really good and some very annoying elements of its UI. And I'm going to fast forward the footage very quickly because I want to get to an actual combat. Oop, I just had the perfect window up. 1 second. There we go. So, this is a classic screen of Darkest Dungeon that's going on right here. Once again, everything is framed properly. We have character information down here, enemy information in the bottom right, characters on the left, which again, we have my cameras reversed, enemies on the right. It's laid out very easy to read what is going on. Even the icons that are underneath each character right now, hey Alberto, are very easily understood. And while the game makes use of its own symbolism, it's all explained really well by the player. Which two on the top are you talking about, Dragon? But while I'm going through it, as another point, everything has tooltips associated to it. All these icons that you can see around characters has its own representation. Middle top. Oh, are you referring to the turn the lighting at the top of the screen? Oh, in between the health bars. Middle top. Do you mean the stress indicator? Or are you talking about the icon directly above? Oh, do you mean the two, like, looks like arrows on top of the highwayman in the middle? Because that represents kind of a positive quirk. Oh. Above their heads. Yeah, like, those represent positive quirks, like the yellow and blue one. I'm going to unpause it here, so you can kind of see things play out. Now, the problem that Darkest Dungeon represents, or the problem with its UI, has to do with allowing the player to make decisions. I think, could you be a little bit more specific about where it's at? If you give me the color of it, that should let me figure that out very quickly. Yeah, so that is the turn order at the top, and the bars on the side represent the amount of fire. Now, it's very hard, unfortunately, to see it just due to how the window is. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, there is the resistances. Let me see if I can... Oh, did not want to do that. There you go. If you look right down here, you can see the resistances of every enemy. The problem with this system is that it requires the player to make a mental calculation that they shouldn't need to. How resistances work in Darkest Dungeon is that the character's percentage is factored in the enemy's resistance. So if I have an attack that's 150% chance to bleed, and the enemy has a 50% resistance, that means it's still 100%. It should be guaranteed. That is on the selected enemy right now. And that UI updates based on what enemy is on my cursor. But the problem with it is that you have to make that calculation every time you play, basically kind of delaying things for a few seconds. And that is something you want to avoid. You don't want the player to be kind of taken out of playing the game in order to figure out what is going on with it. And that represents another very interesting point about UI design. And that is the idea of a dynamic UI. And dynamic UI elements are where we start to get into some very advanced points when it comes to games. and we need to load up some more footage. As soon as we figure that mystery out, now I gotta load up some more footage here of a game that kind of went with it. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom Patreon supporters and sponsors. And if you continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. And you're seeing the UI update. A dynamic UI is basically updating what information I need at any given moment. So while things are paused, you can see right now where I'm exactly moving my character to, where they're being shown, or where they're going to be able to be seen. And if you look at the bottom, and again, it's very hard to make this out, unfortunately, but you can see icons down there that show what units are going to be basically able to be attacked. And this is a very important update that Xcom 2 or War of the Chosen finally adopted as one of its mods. Was that previously, you would never know, as you're looking around this UI, whether or not you would be in a flanking position of an enemy. And that is some very important information when you're trying to make decisions. And ultimately, when it comes to good UI, you always want to give the player enough information that they can make a well-informed choice about what's happening. And in both XCOM Enemy Unknown and XCOM 2 in the original versions, the player never got that information. And in a game like this where one misclick can screw up your entire team, you don't want the player to have to guess as to whether or not something is bad or not. Another great example is being able to move your mouse over a character and see their entire kind of movement radius. We see this in a lot of turn-based or tactical strategy-based titles. And I'm trying to remember a few off the top of my head that you really needed to know that. And the one that's coming up right now is Breath of Fire Dragon Quarter. Because of the fact that the enemies were so dangerous, if you didn't know how far they could move, it could pretty much lead you to being killed by a strong enemy kind of dancing around and attacking somebody. And dynamic UI is always about being able to just quickly give the player the information they need and updating it when it needs to. Another really great example is from the City Skylines game. And what they did was essentially, anytime I click on any civic building, education, fire, health, sanitation, whatever, the game screen will pull up the UI to represent all the major districts of that respective civic. So if I click on fire department, I now see on my screen the entire fire protection overlay. I can go into a secondary screen to view that information as well. But again, when I'm trying to make a decision about where to place down fire departments, it's kind of important to know where I need to get those fire departments. Likewise, if I'm trying to decide between the radius of service of various buildings, it should pull up on the UI, the service radius of that specific structure. And if you don't do that, you don't want the player to have to guess as to where things should go. Or how much information, or kind of like what they need to figure things out. And dynamic UIs are very hard to do right. I'm sure there's probably programming tricks of being able to pull the relevant information. Probably using, I'm going to probably get all the programmers laughing at me. Probably setting up to some kind of like global variable for it to pull from. Now, I have a few more sections I want to talk about here. But a very interesting aspect of UI design, this may actually go longer than I expected, is the idea of a diegetic UI. So here we have footage of Ghostbusters, the video game. And again, Dead Space would be another example of this. And when he's done looking through that little camera here, I'm going to pause the footage just right. Hopefully. We'll see. But as he's running in to hopefully fight these ghosts, that's a kind of a perfect UI right there. If you look on the back of the Proton Pack right now, the two green horizontal bars represents my health. The blue bar on the left represents the cooling of the pack itself. Oh, and Metroid too. And as I gain more weapons in Ghostbusters, the pack will update to represent whatever it is I'm currently using. So really the only non-diegetic UI elements on the screen right now is the money that just popped up and the little indicator that told me to click on for the on-screen guide. But as you can see right now, there is very little in terms of on-screen GUI elements. And this is why diegetic UIs became very popular for a lot of cinematic style games. God of War would be an example, the 2018 version, that you have your health the health bar only shows up when Kratos is in combat, and the screen will flash when he's about to die. That kind of screen flash or having on-screen, changing the graphics to represent health, would be an example of this. It's basically any way to remove the kind of quote-unquote gaminess of UI design. So this is the complete opposite of something like Super Mario, where you have current coins, times, things like that. And Senua, that's a good one. It's kind of tough. It does make use of kind of on-screen elements when you're focusing. But yeah, the blood effect. Insert military shooter here as an example for that one. But diegetic UIs, and I want to go back to Draken's point as well about Metroid Prime. That is another really great example, and we need to play that game on stream at some point because I have no footage of it I can reference. But again, it's almost kind of like a cheat in a very weird way, because it presents a UI, but the UI itself is in the kind of representing a military or a user interface in Samus's suit. So it kind of works in that very weird way. But everything is represented within the span or within the space of the game itself. And it's not something every game can do. Here's your game design challenge for everybody watching. Can you think of a turn-based 4X strategy game that could use a diegetic UI? I don't know if that would be possible. And it's very much limited to games that are more focused on the action or what's going directly on screen. Something like... Yeah, I know. Something like the Souls series probably couldn't get away with a completely diegetic UI. Because I need to know, playing a Dark Souls game, what my stamina bar is. If you run out of stamina in Dark Souls, you are dead. That information needs to be on screen at all times. Likewise, what is available in my quick inventory in the bottom left. And you have to be really careful about what elements you hide from the player and what elements need to be on the screen at all times. Now I'm trying to think if there's another example of something that would be diegetic, or if I want to start to wrap things up. But many games that tend to go for this, when it's done right, it typically will elevate the game to a higher standing. But I think for the final section, I want to just kind of quickly go over some examples of really good UI elements, or games that try to do or some great examples that you can take note of. So in terms of a control scheme, if I can get to it really fast here, when we look at the UI for Spider-Man, we have a very clear framing that's going on, even though it may not look like it. We have Spider-Man's health, as well as combo and focus meter in the upper left. We have special web-based powers in the upper right, minimap in the bottom right, and any kind of context-sensitive elements. And context UIs would also be an example of a dynamic UI in the bottom left. So all four corners are represented in their own way. And because of that framing effect, I know where I need to look at any given time to find information. Now, from a control standpoint, Spider-Man's controls are built around very few buttons, but having them perform tasks that are universal. So if I fast forward the footage here, outside of this combat, I want to get to specifically swinging, which he should start to do in a second. But all swinging in Spider-Man is based on the R2 button on the controller. So as I'm moving around, whenever I need to swing around and get through Manhattan here or through New York, I know to always press R2. L1 and R1 are used for pulling Spider-Man to specific points, and this allows me to just very quickly get accustomed to swinging and moving around Spider-Man. And ultimately, a good UI from a control scheme standpoint, hey Shark, is about I shouldn't have to think about the commands in order to play your game. Now, with that said, there's always a learning curve when it comes to UI like this. And why a tutorial is very important to do right. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit more here. I think we're at the point of stealth, but let me get further here and get back to some more combat. There we go. And again, you can also see where the game borrows from Batman in terms of having Spider-Man get alerted to when an enemy is about to attack. Now, you can see again when it comes to combat that square is your normal attack. Yeah. It's always good to have those quick UI elements. And that was one thing that I use very regularly in Spider-Man. That there are specific rules to how certain enemies behave or how certain attacks work. And you'll see that pop up in the bottom left-hand corner as I'm busy swinging and moving around. But here's a really good example of something very subtle. When you press triangle, Spider-Man will do a web attack that will pull himself right there to an enemy. If I hold down triangle, it will pull an enemy towards Spider-Man. And I don't know if I use that too much during this first play, but I definitely use that as I was playing the game more. And I have footage of me that I'll probably upload into a review of that. So that's a very simple example of using affordance. That I know triangle basically does some kind of pulling effect. So if I hold down triangle, I can quickly associate that to now I won't pull an enemy towards me. Triangle pulls Spider-Man towards the enemy, holding it does the opposite, or it does a very similar action. And you want to avoid actions that are kind of too many on a single button. This is something that we see from a lot of action-based games where you'll have the use button be the punch button. Or better yet, the sneak button is also the same button that could throw a grenade. And Spider-Man actually does this in a very weird case. But the triangle button is the quintessential use button for a lot of actions, like pulling switches or interacting with the environment in Spider-Man. But there's a problem that during a stealth section, there's a later part in the DLC where Spider-Man has to use these little spider drones to snoop around people. And the triangle button is used in the right position to basically do like the reconnaissance. When you press triangle outside of that, it emits his EMP that lets everybody know that the spider drone is there. But to the game's credit, they actually got around that by popping up in the bottom left-hand corner. When you're in position to spy on somebody, it will override the EMP command. So that there's never a case that when the player actually has to make the decision, that they'll press the wrong button. And it was very smart of them to do that with its UI. Now, moving on, there's one final example. I think we'll wrap things up because I didn't think I would get an hour into a discussion about UI design, but apparently, there you go. So, Grim Dawn would be an example of a game that has a lot of quality of life elements to its UI. And I think that will probably be our last point that I want to bring up. Quality of life are elements that make the game easier to play without affecting the gameplay itself. A big one is the use of an item filter. But if I can find some footage of Gear as he is going through this, here we go. Hopefully this will be what I'm looking for. But I'm going to pause things really fast. So right here, when you're looking at the UI for choosing what weapon is better, the game does a few things that are better, but it doesn't go as far as I would like. As you're looking at the gear, it shows you what the difference is in DPS. And that is the ultimate qualifier for whether or not a weapon is better or worse for you. And very simply, it gives us either a green color or a red color to let us know whether the damage is going to be better or worse. And this is a good example of being able to quickly distill down how something changes for the player. And a lot of ARPGs run into this problem of giving the player so much information that it's hard to figure out what is good and what is bad. And Grim Dawn actually does mess up with this when it comes to armor. It doesn't really make it easy for me to understand whether a piece of armor is good or bad for my character at any given time. And part of the problem is that there's so many factors that go into it, it's a lot harder to come with a universal scheme. An armor that is really good for fire damage, for instance, won't help me if I'm fighting ice-based enemies, and vice versa. And this is one of the reasons why for Diablo, they just kind of streamlined it all the way down, just said, every armor has flat defense, there's no real resistances to it, and, the higher the defense rating, the better you are. But I think they could have done something. I think making things a little bit more dynamic would have helped. If I can pull up the example here of the inventory screen again, if I can hopefully find it, I'm going to pause it right here. If you look in the combat stats, for instance, you may not know this if you haven't played Grim Dawn, but the 3 window tabs there show you different information. And when you get to, I think it's the second tab, it shows you your resistances, or it shows you a little bit more of a breakdown of it. And it does show you down there the percentage base. And that was something that I think is very useful. There you go. So it does help out in that regard. But it doesn't go far enough, I think, to show you like slash damage, pierce damage. There's like a whole lot of different types of damage. It at least shows you resistances, but it doesn't show you things such as ice burn, fire, there's ice burn, burning, poison, and all these other crazy effects. I think what the game could have done is that when you're clicking on armor, to probably update what tab you're looking at to give you the most information about what that armor is going to affect. It could even be as much as having a custom dynamic UI that will actually just show you, okay, this armor is going to affect this, 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 and this, and that changes based on the armor you're looking at. And this is another problem that Labyrinth of Refrain has, that you have to flip through 3 different UI panes on the screen for your equipment to make sure that you know what it is that it's affecting. And it can be very confusing because it will show you on the first screen the positives, which it sounds great. This weapon is going to give me, or this armor is going to give me 50 more points of health. But if you scroll to the third window, it will show you, but it's going to take away 500 points of defense. And then you're kind of wondering, why is my character taking all this much damage? But I think with that, my voice is about to cut out on me. I think we'll wrap up this kind of live presentation here. And I guess in summary of everything, UI design is very hard to do right. It's something that it really is based on a case-by-case basis. But in the end of the day, though, it's important to try and figure out what conventions you can make use of and what information the player needs at any given time. Also, if you can turn on or off elements that the player is not going to need, then you're able to make things a lot clearer. Like with the Quest UI up there, I believe I can minimize that so it's not bothering me as much. And as another important point, if the player needs a feature, make sure to spell that out for them. In that dead-end job game, for instance, I can pick up items, but I can't get rid of those items. It's a very weird UI element to that. And you want to make sure as you're playtesting to figure out where the player is focusing their attention on and what information they need at any given time. For instance, if you're playing a strategy or RPG based game and the players are constantly flicking to a specific screen or having to look up information, maybe show that information where it's relevant, or even repeat information as well. But if you have any questions about UI design, let me know in the comments below, and we can always come back to this topic in a future piece. And again, for everybody watching this, let me know what you think about this kind of organization or presentation, as this is kind of the trial run of it. And I'm still not sure if we can figure this out or make it work as a Patreon incentive. If anyone has any ideas about that, let me know. But otherwise, thank you for watching. I'm going to private things up and try and cut things out a little bit to make things more presentable for the recorded side. Oh, thank you, Draken. Oh, and that's the other thing. Remember, overly positive feedback doesn't help as overly negative. I'm sure I'm going to get about 5 people saying they hate this, it's a stupid idea, and 3 more people saying they love it as well. But good feedback, that could be another presentation too. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I need to go get something to eat and actually drink my drink here. I completely forgot we had a second drink here. I need a UI for drinks. I'll be back later for our multiplayer play. Oh, good. And Shark is saying it's a horrible idea with a smiley face. Just like when you say it's go north-south. But thank you for watching. I'm going to go relax a little bit. And let me know what you guys think. But have a great night for this recording. And yeah, next one will be 500 hours long. But I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design. And come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it. And tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.